This is the MHS Pawdcast, the online radio voice of Metuchen High School.
What's up, guys? Happy New Year and welcome to the first episode of 2021 of the MHS Pawdcast, the online radio voice of Metuchen High. I'm Eddie Kalegi. Crazy to think that numerically this is already our fifth year now that we've had content here from the MHS Pawdcast, and we have a busy show to kick off the new year today. We're going to start with an interview, more of a panel discussion rather, with Mr. Schlavis, an APUSH teacher here at Metuchen High School, as myself, Josh Hyman, and Julia Hirschfield will try to contextualize and analyze the unfortunate events that occurred at the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday, and also discuss the power of social media and how it all plays in to this election and how America moves forwards from this tough day. Then we'll be joined by Ms. Cermak, who is currently serving as the advisor of the National Honor Society. The virtual induction ceremony will be live this week, available on YouTube. So we're going to talk to her about the process of applying for NHS this year, how it's been different, and then, of course, how the virtual induction ceremony will be conducted and how it'll be different from what we've come to expect in past years. And finally, Romir Anand and Matthew Chinchar will join us from the Geo Club, as we'll help spotlight that club once again and see what's new with them in their second year as a club and how they've adapted to becoming all virtual from the pandemic. But before we get to all of that, let me just start everything off with a couple of announcements. First off, is a reminder to any senior that they must submit their cap and gown measurements as soon as possible. There are still 65 students who have not yet, and that link is available on the school website. Secondly, also available on the school website under the news tab right now is the newest edition, the winter edition, the second pandemic issue of the Bulldogs Bark. A lot of interesting articles throughout. Sports, also an interesting article about implicit bias that I think is very interesting for people to check out. So if you're interested in reading, it is available on the school website under the news tab. And finally, Superintendent Vincent Caputo announced that COVID-19 testing will be available for free at the Metuchen High School each week. Students and staff can be tested between 3:30 and 6:30 on Thursdays, and between 9:30 and 12:30 on Saturdays. It's a great opportunity to get tested because you never know if you could be an asymptomatic carrier, and already 160 people have taken advantage of this in just the first 3 days. So if you'd like to sign up, it's available online. You have to complete a telemedicine visit prior to your test day, and then you must arrive with a test script to Metuchen High School at your designated time. But that's all for announcements. Let's move into our discussion about the U.S. Capitol incident with Mr. Schlavis, Josh Hyman, and Julia Hirschfield. Continuing on the MHS Pawdcast, Eddie Kalegi here with Josh Hyman and Julia Hirschfield. The assassinations of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, some of the darkest and most unfortunate days in America's storied history. Add January 6th, 2021 to that list. Last Wednesday, a group of protesters angry with the outcome of the 2020 election turned violent and did really the unthinkable, storming and ransacking the historic U.S. Capitol building in a deadly insurrection during the congressional certification of President-elect Biden's victory. There is certainly a lot to discuss and comprehend through this whole situation, so it's great to be joined today by MHS AP US history teacher, Mr. Schlavis. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So before we get to you, I kind of want each of us students to share our impressions on what happened. And I'll go first. I want to first discuss from the perspective of the Capitol, because back in 2015, my first trip to Washington, D.C., I remember when we took a tour of the U.S. Capitol and how difficult it was just to set up that tour. We had to make contact with Congressman Frank Pallone just to get the passes to be able to sign up for a tour, and to see how easy that the protesters were able to get into the building. Really, it's unprecedented, and it's quite the dichotomy from what we come to expect with national security in America. And from my perspective, just sharing my personal opinion here, I did not really agree with the violence that we saw in the summer. I supported the peaceful protests of Black Lives Matter, but I did not like when they turned to riots. And then, that just stemmed to further violence, which ultimately led to what happened with Kyle Rittenhouse. But I don't think any of that even comes close to what happened, because this is the first time in 200 years, 2 centuries of American history, that the US Capitol has been breached. And the fact that so many lawmakers were nearly put in danger is really a bad precedent set here in America, and really just not something we'd come to expect from this country or in this country. So, Julia, over to you. What are some of your impressions from what happened this past Wednesday?
So like you, I was definitely surprised or just shocked at how easily and terribly they got into the Capitol. I wasn't surprised about their presence. It's like, or the event, because honestly, with a president who, ever since the election, has been denying the results, how could there be a peaceful transition of power? But I was so shocked at how they got into the Capitol and the hypocrisy of them not agreeing with the Black Lives Matter protest, only to have a violent uprising of their own. And personally, I don't think it's my place to tell people how to protest something as terrible as systemic racism. It's just not my place. But regardless of whether or not you supported the protest or not, it was so hypocritical and so terrible in the disparity of reaction of the United States government between the Black Lives Matter protests and this insurrection. I saw photos of the Capitol building during Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C., where it was fully guarded and armed. Obviously, that did not happen during the insurrection, as it was not put down immediately. And it's very deeply upsetting to me.
And you bring up an interesting point too about hypocrisy, because I think there's a bit of irony, because the Republican Party took a stance in the summer supporting law and order and supporting police. And it was really surprising to see how they treated some of these members of law enforcement while they were trying to get into the Capitol. The ones that were there, obviously, there wasn't, it's proven by the pictures, the presence of law enforcement there was not the same as the summer, but, it kind of connects to the same thing, because President Trump is in charge of who's going to be there and how much law enforcement is going to be there, because it all comes down from the federal government. And that wasn't really a surprise. It's just surprising to me that it all came to this. Finally, Josh, to you. What are some of your impressions about what occurred on Wednesday?
Well, I'm surprised it happened when it did. I'm not necessarily surprised that something like this did happen. I had a feeling for a while we saw a lot of, left-wing protests and riots turn violent. So my assumption was always that something from the right would happen, but I was not expecting it to happen when it did. And I think the Capitol Police situation, was really mishandled. I think the police chief of DC, and I think the Capitol Police probably didn't expect this either, which is why we saw perhaps the very low police presence. But I think when we have events at the Capitol building, I think it is really important to have that security to, make sure that the Capitol does not get breached and people don't get hurt. But I don't know, I think it was just a really bad thing that happened overall. And I think a lot of the people in the crowd, I don't think we're expecting to do that. I think, it started out with just a few people pushing against the police and trying to get in. And then it just spiraled out of control to everybody just trying to scramble for the Capitol. And, I think all of you saw that video of the woman who's like holding a towel saying, "I got maced and I was trying to." It makes me think that these people had no idea what they were doing. I don't think most of them were, intending to do anything crazy there. I think a lot of these people were just going along with a really chaotic, violent crowd, and some really bad stuff happened. happened.
Yeah, I agree with you there, because I think you can also kind of compare this to the summer as well, in that there was periods when it was a majority that it was peaceful, vast majority. Most people were there to peacefully protest. I think there were more people who were planning for violence here than what we saw in the summer, but still, I think there were people who did not expect that it would come to this. So, sending it over to Mr. Slavis now. I mean, this is an unprecedented event. 2 centuries, and never has the Capitol been breached since the War of 1812. Is there any way to put any historical context into this to really compare it to any sort of past events in American history?
I mean, the short answer is no. This is kind of I think a singular event in its nature. I mean, there's been civil unrest before in the United States, and there's been civil unrest that has turned into pretty large, pretty aggressive kind of outbreaks of violence. I think about like the draft riots in New York during the Civil War. I think about some of the worst, rioting in the cities in the 1960s. And there are other examples too. I'm just kind of throwing out some of the bigger ones. That's kind of civil unrest in the United States is kind of a monster topic that, frankly, like tends to be kind of minimized. I think that we tend to not like to think that our country has periods of unrest that are more than protesting with like isolated violent incidents. There's a lot more violence in domestic protests in American history than I think we would care to acknowledge. But at least to the best of my knowledge, like I can't think of something that was this direct of a challenge to the federal government since when I was talking to my classes about it, I compared it in some ways to like the Whiskey Rebellion and like right after the Revolution, like a direct, not just challenge to the federal government, but in this case, and this is the one thing where I don't know how I feel about comparisons between the summer protests and the rioting that also occurred in the summer, because there were both, and this. And the reason I say it is, and some of this, I think there'll be more information about as time goes on. I mean, the information and the video footage and kind of the firsthand accounts from people inside the Capitol, we're getting a better picture every day. I think the first couple of days, people were still, myself included, kind of processing like what just happened. But I mean, it's now well documented that there were explosives planted at Democratic and Republican party headquarters. There were people going into the Capitol with body armor. There's multiple photos of people going into the Capitol with like zip ties, and not just regular zip ties, the zip ties that are specifically used to restrain people during rioting. Like the kind of makeshift handcuffs that we saw in the summer used by police, except they're being used by protesters or rioters going into the Capitol. And I think that this has a different connotation, frankly, than the summer. Kind of like you said, I don't condone violence in either case, but frankly, I think that the nature of the violence last week is a little bit more eye-opening. And the fact that they were attempting to disrupt the transfer of power, I think makes this very different. So I think this is a singular event in American history, and that's kind of where it looks right now, to me, at least personally.
And people, it's really difficult also. I know I mentioned some of those events at the beginning that have happened that are the most traumatic in American history, but so many of those were foreign attacks against America. It's hard to process that there was a domestic attack against the US government, because I think, I know this might come off as like implicit bias or whatever, but we tend to associate situations like this happening in developing countries, not something that would happen in America, because we see America as a lot stronger than what we saw on Wednesday. But I kind of want to talk about the law enforcement end that I brought up and Julia talked about as well. And I'll go over to Julia first on this. Obviously, it's fair to say that there was a double standard of law enforcement that was on display when you compare the summer to what happened on Wednesday. The fact that there were so few police officers, even the National Guard that the mayor of Washington, D.C. had requested the day before, it didn't really seem like there was that big of a presence immediately. The fact that these people, I mean, you've all seen that video of the one cop that was basically being chased around the building. I believe his name was Eugene Coleman, by so many protesters. It's just him against all of them. And when you think about a country that is so tough on law and order, not seeing a major police presence when you knew there was going to be at least some sort of protests, when this had been promoted for a couple of weeks as the Save America March, there was almost some connotations to that you knew something was going to happen. Obviously to not this extent, but this really proves that there are some issues within law enforcement that we've talked about before that need to be adjusted. So over to Julia first. What are some of these concrete, tangible changes that you think have to be made moving forwards?
There is definitely a double standard as demonstrated. I mean, to be frank, if this wasn't a group of white Americans with Blue Lives Matter flags, I think that the reaction would have been much different. In terms of reforming law enforcement, I am very pro defunding the police. And I know that this is controversial, and I know people don't like the word defunding because people think that that means that we're going to be less safe. But I think that the responsibilities of the police need to be divided. And this isn't necessarily about the protests, because I do think that there needed to be law enforcement at this insurrection, because this was an isolated, crazy event. But in general, I think that the responsibilities of the police need to be divided into more qualified hands. And also, I mean, when you call the police to, for example, take care of somebody who is mentally ill, you expect them to treat them differently than what sometimes ends up happening in reality. And I also think that it's just the whole criminal justice system needs to be revised. And this is not really related anymore, but basically I think that this event proves that law enforcement has more respect for white people than non-white people. And it's all a part of this racist criminal justice system.
And I know it's controversial, and I mean, I might not agree with 100% of that, but you can't deny that there are issues, concrete issues that can be fixed. And it's not that the individual cops per se are racist, but the system itself, we've seen how it's, diverged over these past few months. So it's definitely a tough conversation to have. Josh, what would be some concrete or tangible changes that you think we could see in law enforcement that could help things out in America moving forwards?
I think the biggest thing for at least me, I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it, but I think the biggest thing that we're seeing right now with police is a lack of higher standards and a lack of training. I think a lot of these shootings, a lot of this excessive violence comes from police panicking, not knowing what they're doing, not, having the confidence to act responsibly and in proper proportion to what they're dealing with, So I think if police had more training with, de-escalation maybe, or trained how to use their equipment more effectively, if they were better physically fit so they wouldn't have to resort to harmful tactics like the chokeholds that we've seen, or reaching for their guns or stuff like that. So and another thing I say is you need to build trust within your communities. So the cops trust everybody else and everybody trusts cops would for me be a more optimal solution. So for me, a lot of the police reform that I would like to see is just more training, more responsibility from police, and more, I guess, accountability for policing. But it's very difficult because, you know, every police department is different. You vary greatly from state to state, from city to city. So I think people really also need to get involved locally in their politics to see, you know, to see the changes made that they want, because, you know, the presidential races are important, the Senate's important, the House of Representatives is important, but most police are controlled on the state and local level. So I think, you know, we really need to direct our attention to local and state races and put people in power that we want to see the changes, those being better training, better equipped, and more responsible police.
Definitely. Voting really is the main way to make your voice heard and help to fuel change. But you talked about some of those changes that can be made. I agree. I think that when it comes to police, when there's someone relatable that you know in your town and therefore you can trust, I think it can alleviate some of the stress and some of the animosity that we see between people and cops. I also think, like you said, personal responsibility is key in this situation as well. And cops need to be understood, but also they have to realize that they have an important job. And that's why I kind of hinted at this back in May when we did that panel discussion about race, that I think a licensing system maybe for cops, when you think about other positions where you hold a high responsibility, like a doctor, for example, that you need to be licensed, and you need to have that license checked every couple of years. And I kind of think that's something similar to that could potentially work. Mr. Slavis, I know you know a lot about American history and how everything has passed through over these past few decades. And one of the main themes we've seen in American history, that while change takes a long time to go through, from civil rights to women's rights, it has happened. So what do you think are some changes that we need to see in law enforcement or elsewhere to help prevent not only a double standard, but also what happened on Wednesday?
Yeah, I mean, I think that unfortunately, sometimes, like, even when change is starting to occur, I mean, change happens slowly, whether we like it or not. It just, that's kind of the way it is. And I think that at times, just the way that, frankly, like, things are covered, we tend to, covered in like the media, I think we tend to focus on the failures and not necessarily the successes. And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to downplay some of the problems. What I'm saying is I think that there is progress that can be used as like examples to kind of model for like better or more improvement in you know, relations between police and the communities that they serve. I mean, the most recent example, it was kind of it got a fair amount of coverage, but then like very quickly, obviously everything that happened last Wednesday kind of became the news. So like Newark, New Jersey has been instituting a like a de-escalation program with its entire police force. And the big kind of banner headline just before what happened in the Capitol was that they released their 2020 report. And not only was the Newark police force not involved in any like fatal shootings, but the Newark police force didn't fire a single shot during an encounter with police and a suspect or a member of a community in an altercation. Which, I mean, Newark, coming from where Newark has been in the past in terms of its issues with crime, for the entire Newark Police Department to not discharge a weapon in an exchange at all is kind of incredible. And you know, as I think they rightfully, you know, pointed out, like, it's a sign that de-escalation is working. And seeing those types of programs implemented, I think, is important in not just Newark, but other cities. I think that what a lot of cities and towns have done is there are requirements about living in the communities you serve. You know, like, for example, in a lot of towns, they give priority to hiring people within the community onto the police force. So I think that increasing that is important. New York City while it definitely has issues in terms of police community relations, New York City has attempted over the years to ensure or improve the kind of like demographic representation of its police force to try to make the demographics of its police force reflect the demographics of the city. So, I think these are all steps that need to be taken. And kind of to what Julia brought up with like the defunding of the police. I mean, personally, I think that word defunding is problematic. I think that there could have been a better way to brand that. I think that kind of makes it oppositional. Because I think that the point that police are like kind of overwhelmed, like they've kind of become a jack of all trades type of profession where they are expected to deal with mental health issues and they are expected to deal with, domestic disputes and all of these things that like at times, yes, might need a law enforcement officer, but in many other cases probably would benefit from mental health experts instead. So like I said, I kind of wish that movement had been branded in a different way. Because I think that it is kind of inherently oppositional now. I think that both sides are very kind of defensive about the way that they talk about it. And I think that maybe there was a little bit of an opportunity lost to kind of, improve, I think, not just conditions in communities, but also like relations between police and their communities. But that being said, like it cannot be denied that historically speaking, there are like well-documented instances of, or not even instances, kind of systemic issues related to discrimination. I mean, we know that the war on drugs was highly racialized in terms of the way that sentences were doled out for different types of drug offenses, and that they disproportionately hit minority communities. We know that, at earlier points in history, that police forces were used to put down civil rights movements, to target civil rights leaders. There's a long history of this, as you guys have all kind of pointed out. So, while I think that, de-escalation and things like that are part of the solution, yeah, I think that kind of coming to terms with and acknowledging some of these past injustices is also part of it. I mean, he's known for other things now, but FBI Director Comey, who we all kind of know from the presidential elections in 2016 and all that. Prior to that, he gave a speech to the FBI where he openly acknowledged that the federal, at least the FBI, needs to take a close look at its history. So when you have like the head of the federal police force essentially acknowledging that like there is work that needs to be done.
So the last phase of this, the repercussions of everything that happened on Wednesday, and the main focus over these past few days has been social media. President Trump has been banned from Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, among other powerful social media companies. And recently, the app Parler has come to a major debate. Basically, that was a version of Twitter with little moderation that a lot of conservatives had turned to, and Google Play, Apple, and Amazon have all removed the app from their respective app stores, making it almost impossible to reach. So my question is this, and I'm going to go back to you first, Mr. Slavis, on this, because we know the power of social media, and this past week and really all 4 years of President Trump, we know the power of language as well, and how rhetoric and information can really fuel people and can incite them to do things. And in the past, it was journalism, print journalism, then it was radio, TV. Now social media, especially for the younger generations, who are going to be the ones who are going to be most active in the streets or letting their platforms and their voices be heard. Is this decision, obviously there's reason to remove President Trump from these sites. They explained they don't want him inciting further violence. But does this set a bad precedent? Because we've heard so many people referencing George Orwell and Ray Bradbury and comparing this to censorship and First Amendment rights. How does this all come together? And how can we try to improve the way that people are getting the right information, but are also allowed to express their own personal opinions?
That's a monster question. I think I think that the biggest problem is that we have blurred the lines between fact and opinion to the point that, while I think we all intellectually can agree on the definition of a fact and the definition of an opinion, I think that the way that they are discussed in social media, but not just social media, has now made it almost impossible, at least currently in the current kind of political climate and social climate in the United States. I think it's made it almost impossible to get consensus nationally, which I realize is kind of like a big statement and kind of a dark statement. But I think that unfortunately, this is something that has kind of been a long time coming. And I think that we're unfortunately seeing the results of not really getting a handle on this earlier when we had an opportunity. I think that social media has, unfortunately, even though I don't think this was the intent, I think it has opened a bit of a Pandora's box that way. And what I mean is, the blending of facts and opinions and kind of creating biased versions, like that is something that the left and the right have both been doing for a very long time. And I think that the difference now is that in the past, it was coming from a relatively small number of sources. You mentioned print media. There's a finite number of print sources, right, at any given point. And then even with television, even if you throw all the various cable news channels in, like there's still a finite number of sources. And I think that now, because of social media and kind of what it inherently allows people to do, which is share their opinions, I think it's made us really, really susceptible to manipulation and influence. I mean, we've seen it. There's evidence that it has been done. There's evidence it's been weaponized by foreign powers. And I mean, personally, I think some of it is not even necessarily like the faults of individuals. I think that like human beings aren't really built for this. We're still kind of adapting to it. And what I mean by that is, if you think about it, except for you guys, pretty much every generation prior, we've all kind of been raised, and I'm including myself in this, like everybody was kind of raised with, hey, there's like encyclopedias to go get facts from, and you have newspapers, and you can kind of assume that newspapers are vetting their sources, and like there was already a filter. So we were all kind of raised and conditioned into generally assuming that when information was put out that was like news related, current events related, that at the very least it was vetted to kind of remove, the nonsense, if you will. And I think that social media now, it bombards you with everything. And I think that we're generally kind of, maybe not conditioned, that might be too strong of a word, but I think we generally assume that when we see anything that kind of looks official and looks news-like, that it means that it's accurate. And what that did was, I think that that's opened us up as a population to be fairly easily swayed one way or another. If someone can kind of either present something in a professional, like visual way, or if someone can, play, the old game of, well, I'll tell people something that technically is true, but I'll leave out all the context, and that makes it seem like it's something else, kind of mischaracterizing events. And unfortunately, I think that it's gotten so bad because there's just so many sources and everybody's bombarded that like, it's almost like it's fried our circuits of our ability to really discern what is accurate and what is not necessarily on an individual basis. I'm saying, I feel like this is a society-wide issue. And as a result, it's become politicized, like a lot of things. And what it's done is it's created this issue where now it's like, we don't disagree on political ideas anymore. Now we look at each other as liars. And maybe that seems subtle, or maybe you say, well, maybe I'm being alarmist, but I think that if you really pay attention to like the political discourse in the United States now versus 20 years ago or 30 years ago, people vehemently disagreed with each other. But now I think people look at each other as liars, and it's scary, because when you look at people that way, then there's no way that you can legitimately like accept each other's differences. You know what I mean? And I think that polarization is a very different type and a much more problematic type of polarization than traditional, ebb and flow of the right and left.
Oh, definitely. I mean, with the debate about fake news, which really, I mean, I think it started before the president as well. It's really just been building, like you mentioned, with all of these sources and all these different ways to get information. And there's such few ways now to get pure fact. Like, I was reading a thing on Twitter today, how both CNN and Fox News, we know which direction each of those networks sway, but they are both changing their program lineups heading forwards with more opinion-based shows than fact-based shows. And I don't know if that's the right path, especially with how many different ways you can find out information now online. And when you turn on the news, what do you want to hear? Do you want to know the facts, or do you want to hear someone who has the same opinion as you? And I feel like that's kind of a dangerous setting that we're kind of starting to enter in America. And with all the issues in 2020 and now starting off in 2021, it's kind of fueled that. So quickly, I'll go to Julia first here. What do you think this whole situation really with social media and its power, how is this affecting our country, and how can we, as students, make ourselves more informed?
Well, in Mr. Schlavis's sociology class, I actually watched the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which really revealed the impact of social media on the polarization in this country between political views. Facebook's, what's the word? The system that gives you recommended posts. What was that?
Suggestions, probably something like that. I don't know. I'm not a Facebook.
Algorithm. That's the word. The algorithm encourages radical groups and conspiracy theorists because that increases their watch time, which increases their profit. Additionally, Facebook, I remember in the 2016 election, actually sold advertisements to Russia to sway the election in Trump's favor. And these are just some examples, but social media is completely unregulated. And I know that obviously now they're trying to make an effort because people are realizing how damaging it is, but it still has a long way to go because there is now such a line between fact and opinion. And I know you were comparing it to Orwell. I don't think that's the same because Orwell is a work of fiction, but it's also just it's an opinion, and it's an opinion. Whereas on social media, when people are posting things, you don't really know what's a fact and what's an opinion. So I encourage all of our peers to take everything they see on social media with a grain of salt. And I'm privy to this too, because I don't really use social media anymore, but when I was on it, I got my news from social media and I wouldn't always check everything, and that's really bad. And actually, after watching The Social Dilemma, that's why I deleted social media. So I definitely encourage everyone to be careful.
And you talked about regulation, and then that also brings up another fine line. Before I go over to Josh, I just wanted to talk about this because there's so many people, first of all, who are saying that the removal of people is the encroachment on First Amendment rights, but legally, the First Amendment only applies to things that are government controlled or regulated. So you could really only consider that if it was government regulated. But at the same time, for example, if they made Twitter, if the government took control of Twitter, then you also go to a dangerous fine line where the government is censoring what you can see and what you can believe and what you can think. And then that's when those issues from the George Orwell works like 1984 kind of come up. So it's a fine line. We've kind of dug ourselves into a bit of a deep hole with social media, but it's just something that we're going to have to try to adapt to and try to inform ourselves as well as we can. Last thing in this interview, Josh, I'll just give it over to you. Same question I posed to Julia.
Yeah, I agree with a lot with what both Mr. Schlavis and Julia said. I think social media is something we have never, ever experienced before in human history. And I think big tech as a whole, I think we really need to be careful with it. I know in America we're really concerned about, government intervention in business, the whole it's a private company, they can do what they want. I agree with that a lot, but up to a certain extent where we have these companies that have so much power that can, silence the sitting US president or, suppress stories from 200-year-old newspapers. I think we really run into a dilemma here. And I don't know if you know this, but most of the web service providers, there are only four big ones, Apple, Google, Amazon, and I believe I'm forgetting the last one. But like if you get banned from any of those four or all of those four, it's very hard to, make a presence on the internet for yourself. And Eddie, we go back to, you were talking about Parler for a bit. They were taken off a lot of these media sites, and it's extremely difficult for them to run a site because they don't have the money. And that's where I kind of have a problem with like the whole it's a private company, or if you don't like Twitter, then go make your own. Well, these people did make their own, and now they're being run off the internet. So I think that's also a problem. Like, where do we stop? Where do we say, okay, you companies are too big, you're too powerful, you need to stop? But where does that become too much government intervention? So I think I think that is definitely an issue we have. And I think a lot of the politicians in government, they are trying, but I think, like, especially going after Section 230, I think is not the right move, because I think if you get rid of Section 230, government censorship will just become worse, because that I think removes their public platform status and makes them liable for anything posted on their website, so they can just get rid of anything they want, which is going to be worse. And another thing with social media is, like you said, you can pretty much live in your own reality in social media. You can decide to get your news from right-wing sources or left-wing sources, and you'll just have a story that confirms your bias. So I think that's really dangerous, and especially now where a lot of media sites, they just want to be the first one to break a story, or they want to be the one with the most exciting title or get the most views on their story. So they might come out with opinions, or they might break a story before all the facts are out, and you get serious problems with that. And another thing is, like Julia said, algorithms, they just catch you in a loop and keep you going with whatever you want to hear. So I would really strongly advise that a lot of the kids our age, I would advise them to maybe take a break from social media, maybe try not to reaffirm their biases, try to find things that make you uncomfortable, read them, try to learn. You should definitely be getting your news from a bunch of different sources, whether it be right wing, left wing, something more unopinionated. If you listen to political commentary or pundits or whatever, I would also recommend, trying to understand both sides, because that's where we get the division. That's where we get the the rift between people in America, is that they only want to listen to things that reaffirm their biases. So I think to challenge yourself, you have to listen to the other side and at least understand why people think the way they do. And I think that could help. I think that could help mend the divide in this country, if people just understand the other side instead of thinking, no, this person's wrong, no, this person's evil, how could you think that? And I think that starts with you. I think that starts on a personal level, when people in the same household or friends understand why people think the way they do, and understand that most people just care about this country, but just have different opinions on how we get it fixed. I think just starting on that personal level helps in the long run get to mending the divide in this country. But I think we're still a long way off, and I think it's going to take a lot of effort on an individual level and on a broader, societal scale.
That is true, but I think that's a perfect way to end it, because being able to, come together with your differences and be able to discuss things and consider multiple viewpoints, that's exactly what we just did here. And it shows that, our generation, we might be the ones that can help to alleviate some of these problems in our country. But Mr. Slavis, thank you so much for joining us today and adding some context and analyzing this really from a historical perspective. And I mean, this was an unprecedented event. Obviously, in our lifetimes, we've never seen something like what happened on Wednesday. It was great to kind of discuss it and its implications.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure, guys.
So coming up next, we will have 2 interviews, one to preview the NHS virtual induction ceremony and another to spotlight the Geo Club. For Julia Hirschfield and Josh Hyman, I'm Eddie Kalegi. This is the Metuchen High School Podcast, the online radio voice of MHS.
Having trouble seeing the board in class? Do you need safety glasses for your school sport? If you answered yes to either of these questions, head over to Optique Unique, the eyeglass store at 406 Main Street in Metuchen. Optique Unique does it all. Not only do they offer eyewear for all ages, they also sell sports-specific safety glasses for kids and adults. Call them at 732-321-2020. That's 732-321-2020, or visit OptiqueUnique.com. Do you want to build character, build confidence, or even build yourself? All that and more can be accomplished at the Black Belt Institute at 23 New Street, right here in Metuchen. Students of all ages have been able to learn respect, discipline, fitness, and self-defense from their experienced instructors for over 20 years. Whether you're an adult looking for stress reduction or know someone young who has interest in Taekwondo, the Black Belt Institute is the place to go. The Institute takes a fun approach at teaching the rules of self-defense, instilling in their students an I-can-do-it attitude. Interested in taking a class? Call them at 732-205-9797 or visit their website at blackbeltinst.com. Once again, that's 732-205-9797 or blackbeltinst.com. The Black Belt Institute, Metuchen's leader in martial arts and fitness.
Welcome back to the Metuchen High School Podcast, the online radio voice of MHS. I'm Eddie Kalegi here with Itai Geller. At long last, the National Honor Society will be conducting their annual induction ceremony. It will be virtually, but it's this week for the incoming juniors and seniors. To discuss, it's great to be joined by the current NHS advisor, Spanish teacher at Metuchen High School, Ms. Cermak. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so to kick things off, we'd like to know, so now that you are filling in for Miss Falls in this position while she's on maternity leave, is there anything that you enjoy most about serving this role?
I would say that, well, this year in particular, I've been super impressed with the NHS students and just their level of communication. The officers, I would say, especially have been so responsive. I feel like I'm communicating with adults, and they've been a major support in navigating some of the new virtual challenges, I guess I would say. I would also say, in addition to that, there are so many students who really take initiative with regard to serving people around them, people in the community, people in the school. And I've had students even contact me on Christmas Day this year about something that went on in town, just to reach out and say, hey, can you put this out there for the NHS members to see if anyone wants to help? And I really am a fan of that and really want to continue to encourage that in all of them.
So getting into the specifics, like for people who are underclassmen or in the middle school or don't go to the school, who aren't familiar, what is the National Honor Society all about, and how do students apply and get accepted?
So National Honor Society, it varies based on the school, but here at Metuchen High School, the requirements that we have set for students academically, they need to have a 3.7 cumulative GPA in order to be considered a candidate for NHS. Beyond that, we'll take teacher recommendations and look into their conduct report. And I would say I guess I'll mention that the 4 pillars of NHS overall are scholarship, leadership, service, and character. And we look for students who really exemplify those and commit to continuing their work and success in each of those categories.
Okay, so knowing that you have to be inducted into this program, how will this year's virtual induction ceremony be similar and different to its in-person counterparts in the past years?
So this year is very different. It's taken us a while to figure out exactly how to navigate the induction process, and I haven't rushed the process just to force it. The students who are inducted have already begun doing some of their service and are maintaining their character and continuing to work as hard as they can academically. The induction typically takes place in the fall, but this year we are doing it during January this month. And the way that we're going about it is through a video. And there have been a few students who have helped create a video to honor and induct the new members. And that has also been in conjunction with the Metuchen High School Media Club. And typically there are speeches by key administration within the school and the school district, and those are still happening. It's just via recording. The video itself includes a photo of each of the inductees, their class year, and it's going to cycle through that with the vice principal announcing the name of each student. So instead of going up on stage, and then we're assembling the certificates, the officers are helping me with that. And we're going to put a message out there for the new inductees to pick them up from the vestibule at the school, and we'll go from there. But I would say communication with NHS has been through Google Classroom, and it's been super efficient that way. So I feel like that is something to continue with in the future.
Well, it's great that the tradition has been able to continue even with how different this year has been. So last thing I want to touch on, like you alluded to earlier, that once inducted, students have to complete a set number of service hours. And you mentioned how different people in the NHS have already been helpful with trying to find opportunities, because it's a whole other thing this year, because it's a weird conundrum, because in some ways it feels like it's easier to find things where you can volunteer because there seems to be more people in need with everything that's happening. But then at the same time, trying to find things that you can do safely to get those service hours. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how the pandemic has affected the process of finding potential volunteering opportunities.
So I guess I can list some of the things that I've seen so far, and I'm sure it will continue to evolve. Some of the students have been tutoring. We still run a tutoring program with NHS. I would say we got far less requests than we have in the past, but there's a lot of students who are very responsive and looking at the tutor request form and seeing when something comes in and emailing me pretty quickly to say that they would take the position. And they coordinate with the tutie and family, whether they do it through Zoom or whatever the logistics are there. So I've seen a lot of that. There was a recent tragedy in town with a house fire, and students reached out to me about that. And typically I guess I'll compare this to food drives. When we hold food drives, usually NHS members can count some of their donations towards a set number of hours to acknowledge that they are still helping, but it's in a physical object, a tangible object type way. So just like with the food drive, we put something out there where if students chose to donate to I believe it was a GoFundMe, something like that. Maybe it was through Fuse 5K, the Fuse Deal Foundation. Any donation was eligible for a certain number of hours. And we didn't quantify the donations. It was if you donated $1, same number of hours if you donated $100, because it's the heart behind it. And I really like that a lot of the students made a point to do so in their own name or contributed to their family's donation. And to start thinking about that, I think is really valuable. Aside from that, one student was donating collecting blankets for an animal shelter. And so put that opportunity out there, and we quantified the number of blankets for a certain number of hours. So there've been so many more opportunities than I've expected. It's just a matter of communicating with me as the advisor and saying, does this count? What is this worth? How do we quantify this?
Well, it's great that the NHS has still been able to continue through all of this, and the virtual induction ceremony will be available this week online, and more information is available about it on the high school website under the news tab. Ms. Cermak, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much.
All right, and for Itay Geller, I'm Eddie Kalegi. Let's move into our final interview of the day, a Geo Club Spotlight with Romir and Matt. The Geo Club is now in its second year at Metuchen High School. Joining us now are the two club co-presidents, seniors Romir Anand and Matthew Chinchar. Thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thanks for having us, Ed.
Thanks, Ed.
So to get it started, why did you guys decide to start the club last year?
So Chinchar and I both noticed that there was a a huge following for geography, and specifically the video game GeoGuessr, which is a Google Maps based geography game in Metuchen High School. So we figured that we could create a club surrounding geography and specifically the game GeoGuessr, and create a community surrounding the world and all the beautiful places that it has to offer. And we found that there was a lot of interest in this, and Geo Club has become a pretty successful club even through COVID. So yeah, that's why I created the club. Well, both of us created the club, and it's been pretty successful. So yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk about COVID, because there was only a few in-person meetings, and then the pandemic hit, and you guys had to completely sort of change the platform of the club since it's online. Obviously, GeoGuessr, an online game, that's not that difficult, but how have you guys been able to adapt the club to make it easy to do online?
We've definitely been able to adapt very well. I mean, like you said, Geo Club is a virtual experience. Everything is online. We've had an easy time communicating. We have a remind. It's really been easy to communicate with members, try and recruit new members, and it's every week we have been able to adapt well to it. We've been able to yeah.
Okay, so you've talked about your past. What are some future plans for the pandemic? Oh, sorry, for the club heading through the remainder of the year?
Yeah, so as of right now, we are gonna keep continuing our meetings on Zoom every other week. We play GeoGuessr, we play other geography related games. But hopefully as the weather gets warmer and hopefully the cases go down, we might be able to organize some outdoor trips such as hikes. And another thing we were looking into is geocaching, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's basically there's small boxes or like containers hidden all over, and you use this app to try and locate them. So that's a pretty fun group activity that hopefully we'll be able to experiment with the members of the club as the weather gets warmer, and hopefully the pandemic situation gets better.
So last question, why should students join the Geo Club, and what should they do if they're interested in joining?
So if you have any interest in geography, you share a passion for it, you want to learn more about the world, more about different nations' flags, what differentiates different parts of the world, in addition to their similarities. There's so much you can learn in this club. You're not always taught geography in this school, and this club is really a way for you to be able to learn more about the world, what makes different places unique. And every member of the club has something they bring to the table each week, and it's every other week, and it's honestly really special to have all of us with our own different geographical skills that we bring to the table. And it really helps all of us become better global citizens, which I definitely think is super important.
So Geo Club meets every other Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Romir, Matt, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so that'll wrap up today's show. For our other guests, Ms. Cermak and Mr. Slavis, and for Joe, Itai, Julia, and Josh, I'm Eddie Kalegi. We'll see you next time on the Metuchen High School Podcast, the online radio voice of MHS.